Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at round number 8 of the Qatar Masters Open being held here in Doha. Now, as you guys know, the 5-time former world chess champion Magnus Carlsen lost a stunning game to the Indian talent Karthikeyan Murali yesterday. So would Magnus be able to bounce back? Now, for Magnus, after losing yesterday, any chance of winning this tournament went out the door. But nonetheless, he does want to put together a couple of good games here at the end, because otherwise he could be in danger of losing the #1 spot in the world to Fabiano Caruana after a surging victory in the U.S. Championship. All right, let's jump right into the action. So today, Magnus Carlsen is playing against Gregory Kaidanov from the United States. Now, for Magnus, I'm sure it's a great sign that he's not playing another Indian player. He finally gets someone from a different country. That being said, the one player he's played in the tournament prior to today was Alisher Suleimanov from, I believe, Kazakhstan, and he got soundly trounced. So, to the action. Magnus playing against Gregory Kaidanov. Now, before we jump specifically into the game, I do want to give a big shout out to Gregory Kaidanov. He is a player who's been around the United States chess scene for many, many years. I actually played against him all the way back in 2004. I beat him in a very critical Grunfeld to win my first U.S. championship. It was technically called the 2005 U.S. championship, but amazing memories from nearly 20 years ago. Ooh, I'm getting old. All right, so Magnus starts off the game with d4. We get d5, bishop to f4 from Magnus. Magnus deciding to say, you know what? I'm going to play a London system. I don't want to end up in some big theoretical battle. Now we get c5, e3, knight c6. Magnus plays c3. Classic setup here with this pyramid structure with the 3 pawns all connected. We get knight f6, knight d2, e6, and now knight gf3. Now, all standard so far. For those of you guys who are wondering about the London system, I have some great videos on my channel. Specifically, I did some collaborations years ago with both Foosley and Pokimane, prominent Twitch streamers, on the London system. So if you're a beginner and you're looking for something specific to the London, those would be some good videos to check out. So we get c takes d4. Magnus takes with the e-pawn here. Generally, in this structure, white takes with the e-pawn. Thus, white can always try to play for the e5 square, and additionally put either a rook or queen on the e5. So we get knight h5 here, and now we have to move bishop e3. Now, years ago, Wesley So was one of the original pioneers of this opening. He played against, I believe, Anish Giri. Of course, Hikaru also played this in the U.S. Championship against Gata Kamsky. So a lot of games have been played in the system. So we get bishop e3, bishop d6, Magnus goes bishop d3, Kaidanov plays knight f4, and now Magnus trades off his dark square bishop for the knight on f4. Now, at first glance, you're going to say, wait a second, haven't you said in many videos the bishop pair is better for one side? And in this case, one of the reasons the bishop pair is not as effective as it normally would be is that this light square bishop is somewhat hemmed in by the pawn structure. You have no scope on this diagonal. Even if you push b6, for example, so you get castles and b6, your bishop really doesn't have any scope here. And meanwhile, white's bishop is perfectly placed on d3 to dominate this bishop on c8. So we get castles being played. Magnus goes rook e1. We get bishop d7. Now we get this move knight b3 from Magnus. Magnus is intending to use these knights and jump either to c5 or e5 here. So Kaidanov plays b6, stopping the knight jump to c5. We get queen e2. We get g6 here. g6 is a move that black is able to play because it stops any threats on the diagonal from d3 to h7. Additionally, you're not really worried about the dark square weakness around your king because white doesn't have a dark square bishop. In a worst case scenario, if g3, bishop h6, king g2 is played, you can always go bishop g7 and fianchetto your bishop here with the bishop protecting the king. So we get a4 from Magnus, f6 played here by Kaidanov. Very logical move. Kaidanov wants to play e5, build a big black center, but also unshackle this bishop. If you could get something like e5 and then bishop g4, for example, suddenly these bishops are really, really well placed. You've got this nice big black center, and black is doing quite well. So Magnus, of course, doesn't want to allow that, so he plays bishop b5, pressuring the knight on c6. So here, if black were to play e5, after takes, white is simply up a pawn in the center, and with these knights on d4 and e5, white is doing very well. So we get queen c7. Also here, bishop b5 threatens potentially to trade the bishop for the knight, take this pawn with check, win the bishop on c6, and it's GG as well. So we get queen c7 to guard the knight on c6. Magnus plays a5. We get rook a e8 here. Kaidanov going all in here to try and build a big black center. We get g3 played by Magnus. A good move, tempoing the bishop here, so the bishop has to move, but also creating some Lufthansa for the king on g2. Now with the Luft for the king, there will never be any ice skaters on the back rank. Additionally, you'll notice that if black goes bishop d6, suddenly there are no threats on the diagonal because these pawns blunt the bishop. So we get g3. And now Kaidanov plays the move bishop h6 instead. We get a takes b6, a takes b6, and now Magnus goes c4. Now, Magnus is playing a very, very thematic game here. He wants to attack the center here before black can play e5. So when white goes c4, if black could get, let's just say this structure, for example, the 2 pawns on e5 and d5 versus the pawn on d4, black is doing very well fundamentally. Likewise, if you can get this position with e5 here, black is also doing very well. But the problem is when white goes c4, now you can't really go e5 without hanging the pawn on d5. And if you ever trade the pawns on c4, suddenly this pawn on e6 is a serious weakness. Now, this position, white would probably take with the queen, actually, to pressure the queen and the knight. But nonetheless, black can no longer get the big center with these 2 pawns because you lost this pawn on the d5 square. So after c4, we get d takes c4. Magnus plays queen takes c4. And now we have the move queen to d6 being played here, dodging any pins on the c file. Now Magnus goes rook to a6, illustrating why he played a4 and a5 in the first place, opening up this file for the tower. Now, in the game of chess, when you have these towers, the 2 towers in Isengard and Baradur, you want to have them on the open files. Towers on the open files are worth a lot. So after rook a6, we get rook b8, and now Magnus plays this great knight sacrifice with this move, knight to c5, pressuring the pawn on e6, the bishop on d7, and suddenly black is in a lot of trouble. Now, black is not losing here because he has a resource to re-sacrifice a horse with knight takes pawn. But if black were to take what looks like a free horse on c5, after d takes c5 and queen to c7, white will trade the bishop for the knight on c6, take this pawn with check, attacking the king, and after, say, queen f7 and then rook takes c6, for example, in this endgame, white has an extra pawn, which he can push up the board, and he should be winning. So Kaidanov re-sacrifices a horse with knight takes d4, and now Magnus plays knight takes knight, and we get queen takes knight on c5. Now, after queen takes knight, we get this very nice move, rook to a7, which is played here. Now, Magnus could have played bishop takes d7, temporarily sacrificing the queen, and after queen takes c4, bishop takes e6, takes rook e6. White is better here, but probably the reason Magnus skewed this variation is because after rook d8, knight c6, rook d1, and king g2, he probably thought after rook to b7, black has much better drawing chances in this endgame with the 4 versus 3 than if he were to keep pieces on the board. So Magnus here is playing the position, trying to play the odds where he thinks his opponent has more chance of blundering in the endgame. As such, Magnus plays rook a7, and now we get rook b d8, and here Magnus plays the move b4. Now, these are not the best moves by Magnus, but nonetheless, in this position, Magnus will win back this pawn on e6, all the while creating the kebab on the 7th rank with this rook and hoping for some mistakes. So here Kaidanov plays rook f8, which is a serious mistake. Now, on top of the slight struggles in this endgame that Kaidanov has, he's also getting low on time. Now, it's very, very rude of a player like Magnus, who's very young, to try and put pressure on the clock against a guy like Grigory Kaidanov, who is 64 years old. It's simply very rude, and Magnus doesn't know how to respect his elders. Nonetheless, jokes aside, it is a serious game, and you do want to try to play on the board, but also on the clock as well. So rook f8 is played, and now Magnus plays this b5 move, which is an excellent move, fixing the pawn on b6 here. This pawn can no longer move, and down the road, white still can always recapture this pawn on e6. So here Kaidanov plays bishop c8. We get knight c6 from Magnus, a very nice move, understanding that he does not want to trade the knight on e6. Because after takes, bishop e6 and king h8, black will play rook d6, and at least one set of rooks probably comes off the board, something like this, for example. And with the opposite color bishops here, black has great drawing chances. So Magnus instead plays knight c6, we get rook d6, and now this nice move, rook c7. And what Magnus also realizes here is that this bishop on c8 is extremely passive in this position. The bishop has no squares on this diagonal, the pawn on e6 is in the way, so you can never activate the bishop this way, and white is threatening to go knight a7 or knight e7 to gobble up the bishop on c8. So here we get bishop d7, which simply loses the game on the spot. What Kaidanov had to play was this move king h8, but again, after a move like knight to e7 or even a move like rook to a1, it looks really, really scary here. White's trying to line up castle mania on the 7th rank with the rooks, and it's just very hard to defend. So Kaidanov plays bishop d7, but now Magnus does have rook a1. And just to illustrate one more point, the reason that this is not actually winning on the spot here is black does have rook d7, so that white can't coordinate the rooks on the 7th rank. Whereas in the game, after we get bishop d7, rook a1, black cannot go rook d7, so white is getting castle mania on the 7th with 2 rooks, and it's dire straits for black. So Kaidanov plays bishop f8, we get rook a7, trades the bishop for the knight, but now Magnus has a passed c pawn here. But on first glance, you think, well, black is holding here, white can't play rook g7. So there are no actual threats on the 7th rank yet, but the problem is white has this passed c-pawn, which is going to be a big issue as well. So we get rook d1. Magnus plays king to g2. We get the move rook to c1 being played here. And after rook to c1, Magnus goes rook a4. Maybe not the absolute best move, but very understandable because Magnus wants to keep this bishop on c4, shielding the rook. And what I mean by shielding is if you ever move the bishop to, say, b5 and you get this position, the rook is always spying on the pawn on c6. But when you go rook a4 here, the bishop shields the pawn. The rook can't touch the pawn here. And Magnus has a simple idea that he wants to go rook b7 and, say, c7. And again, with the bishop being, or not the bishop, sorry, the pawn on c7 being shielded by the bishop, white is completely winning. So Kaidanov plays b5 here, giving up his extra pawn here, hoping that now he can play rook c5, and white no longer gets to build a shield. So Magnus plays bishop c4 here, which is apparently wrong, but not a huge issue, putting the bishop on c4 to target the pawn and the king as well. So we get bishop d6 here, rook b7 played, and now Kaidanov plays move king h8, which simply loses on the spot. But it's hard to really fault Kaidanov, because if he were to take the pawn on c6, there's bishop b5, and white will win one of these rooks on c6 or e8 and then on the next turn. So we get king h8 here from Kaidanov. Obviously, Kaidanov very low on time here. He's 64 years old. Magnus not being very nice here, and Kaidanov does play king h8. Now, after king h8, there's this move, bishop takes e6, and now the game is effectively over because if black takes the bishop on e6, there's rook to a8, and we have the classic ladder checkmate with the two towers, bishop b8, rook e8, rook e8, and the king simply has no squares available. Additionally here, if black plays rook takes pawn now, white has bishop d7 again with the classic wooden shield, and white will win one of these rooks. So we get rook e7 from Kaidanov, desperately trying to trade off a set of rooks here. We get rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, but now after rook to a8, king to g7, and rook to a7, Kaidanov is simply going to lose the game because the bishop is pinned. Additionally, if you move the king to f8 to guard the bishop, now there's c7, rook guards the pawn, bishop guards the queening square, and you have to sack the rook and lose the game. So Kaidanov plays rook c6, we get rook takes e7, king to f8, rook to f7, and now Kaidanov resigns because if he goes king g8, white can simply retreat with the bishop to a2. If you try to target it with rook a6, there's rook a7 check, creating the classic fossil here, and white wins the game. And if you go king to e8, for example, after bishop d7 check, king f7, bishop c6, both sides have 3 pawns, but white has an extra bishop, and for a player of Magnus's caliber, he will never mess this up. So Magnus wins this game. He moves back into sort of some contention to make it respectable, maybe finish top 3 or 4 if he wins tomorrow with 5.5 points out of 8. So let's jump now to my game. So in round number 8, I am playing against Venkatesh Pranav from India, very affectionately known as Buddy. So Buddy is somebody that I've played against many times over the years. He's a player that in the old days I would farm for a lot of rating points. He played under the account VPranav, VI_Pranav, I believe to be technically correct. And I would play a lot of blitz games. I was able to adopt him, beat him many games. But unfortunately, with all the kids that I've played on the internet, they improve from the games they play against me. So Pranav has actually become a player who I still generally score about 60 to 70% against, but scoring 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 is a far cry from scoring 9.5 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 and finishing up with the adoptions. So Pranav has been improving. I've been following his progress, and he's now up to about 2,600, and he gets a chance to play against me over the board finally. So in this game, I play d4. We get knight to f6, c4, e6, and now I play knight to f3. We get b6, and I play this move a3. Now, this is what is commonly known as the Queen's Indian defense with b6, and a3 is a move that has been in vogue lately. I believe it was played in the game between Suleimanov and Magnus Carlsen with the whole time affair. It also was played against me in the Chess Champions Tour by Magnus a couple of weeks back. So this A3 system, which is known as the Petrosian system, named after the famous world chess champion Tigran Petrosian, has become popular again. So we get bishop a6 from Pranav. Now I play queen c2 to guard the pawn on c4. We get bishop b7, knight c3, c5, and now I play e4 here, building the big white center with these 3 pawns. Now, one of the reasons black plays the system, it probably looks very weird, like why do you go bishop a6 and then bishop b7, is that in this position after e4 takes, black is hoping to take advantage of the queen being misplaced on c2 down the road with some kind of rook c8 idea. So we get bishop c5, and now I play the move knight to b3. We get the move knight c6, and now I play this quiet, innocuous-looking move f3. Now, this is where Pranav started using time for the first time in the game. I think it's not a move he's familiar with. Bishop g5 is a move that has been played before here, but after bishop g5, black can play a move like castles. Even moves like knight d4, I believe, exist here, and black is doing completely fine. So I play f3, just a little bit of a wrinkle here, and now Pranav decides to castle. Now, after he castles, I take the bishop on c5 and play this move bishop e3. He goes d6 to guard the pawn on c5, and now I play bishop d3. Now, this game is very, very tricky because what really matters here for black is, can black take advantage of white lacking in development to get the bishop pair, or will white finish his development before black can create some concrete threats in the center? Now, computer thinks that it's about equal here, but nonetheless, from a human perspective, when your opponent gets the two Bs, it always feels a little bit uncomfortable. Also, unlike in the Magnus game where Magnus gave a bishop pair, here my bishops are very nice. Now, the bishop on d3, it is blocked temporarily, but down the road, I can play for something like, let's just say f4, and potentially something like e5 to open up the scope. Additionally, down the road, I can also play something like b4, and later on something like c5 to open up this diagonal. So even though the light square bishop doesn't look great in this game, there are many chances to open up the diagonals, and my bishop on e3, of course, is very, very well placed here. So Pranav plays the move rook c8 here. I castle, and now he goes rook e8, and now I play this move rook fd1. Now, what Pranav is banking on in this game is that he's hoping he can play d5 and open up the center. If black cannot play d5 from a general standpoint, white should be better. And if black ever goes to e5 to try and build a diamond hands formation, for example, queen f2 and knight d4, white can always try to chip away at the bastion with b4, followed up with a move like rook to b1, intending to try and open up the b file. Additionally, down the road, I might even be able to reroute this bishop to a4 and activate this light square bishop on another diagonal. So we get queen e7. I go queen f2 here to stop knight d4. Now Pranav plays knight e5. I go bishop to e2. And now he plays this move bishop a6. Now this was also a very critical moment in the game because black can try to play d5 and explode the center. Now after pawn takes, and I believe knight takes, and knight f3, bishop f3, queen e3. White is probably a little bit better in this endgame after queen e3, rook e3, and rook c1, but I wasn't 100% sure if it's all that good. Actually, as you see from the bar is going down, and now the computer is starting to agree more with me, and it's not conclusive whether white is winning. So I thought this was a very interesting try by Pranav to play d5. At the end of the day, he decides not to. Instead, he plays bishop a6. Now he helps me improve my position with b3. Now the pawns are connected. We get rook e d8. And now I play this move h3. Now, h3 is a move that I played here with a 35-minute plus advantage on the clock. And the reason I played it is I simply want to kick these knights out of the center. So if I were to play f4, for example, here, black can go knight g4 here, and black will trade one of his knights for my dark square bishop. So when I play h3, my plan is that I will go f4. There's no knight g4 anymore because the pawn in h3 covers it. And now after knight c6, I can even play like g4 maybe. I can even go bishop f3. And I just have a lot of space for these bishops here. Actually, I've activated the light square bishop on a much better diagonal now as well. So the reason I'm a little bit critical of the move, however, is that now I force Pranav to play this move knight c6. Now, this is actually a blunder, but we end up in a situation where I have to play a lot of best moves, and if I play the best moves, probably I should win the game. But if I make even one slight mistake, I'm probably going to lose my time advantage and probably not win the game as well. So it's very much a double-edged sword. So Pranav does play knight c6, and now I have to go for b4 here. If I don't play b4, let's say I go f4, for example, black can play e5, and now he's getting knight d4 here. And in this position, now the pawn on e4 is not guarded by a pawn on f3 since it's on f5, so e4 can become a little bit weak. Now, of course, the computer gives white a big advantage in this position, but for a mere 2800 level player like myself, I think it's a little bit too much to expect me to play this perfectly. For example, say rook b1, bishop b7, bishop d3, and let's just say black waits with bishop c6. Now, again, I can go g4, g5. I can always play b4, but it's not so obvious where the big advantage is. And more importantly, all my opponent's moves will be reactionary to whatever I do because he has the ideal setup here with this knight on d4. So in this position, I play b4. I go all in. We get pawn takes, and now he plays knight takes b4, taking a free pawn while guarding the bishop. Here I go rook a4, hitting both the knight and the bishop at the same time. Pranav plays d5, and now I go rook to b1, attacking the knight on b4 twice. Pranav plays knight to c2, and this is where I use forever. I give up my entire time advantage and use 20 minutes before playing this move e5. Now, in this position, there were a couple things that I thought. First of all, I was very confident at first that after pawn takes, and bishop g5, I was very close to winning due to the pin as well as the bishop on a6 being weak. But after this move, queen to e5, hitting the bishop and the knight, bishop takes knight, and pawn takes, I simply did not see how to continue the game. Now, if I had really been calculating deeply and thinking more from a logic perspective than pure calculation, probably I would have gone for this, because after knight takes pawn, black can sack the rook. And then after pawn takes rook, queen takes e2. Here, it looks like black has two pieces, the bishop and the knight for the rook, and black is okay. But the computer says after queen g3, king h8, and queen to d6, white is winning here because you're hitting both the pawn on f6 and the bishop on a6 at the same time. And if black plays knight e3, trying to checkmate, there's check, king g8, check, guarding the pawn. And after king to h8 here, you can sack the rook for the bishop on a6. And after queen takes a6, queen takes e3. White simply has white has one extra pawn here, but black's king is very open, and technically speaking, this should be winning. But alas, I spent a lot of time, I couldn't quite work out this whole variation, and then I started thinking to myself, okay, well, maybe I can go bishop a7, and the reason I thought this was playable is because after bishop takes c4, for example, after I take, I'm hitting this knight on c2. So if black plays rook takes c4, takes, at first glance, it looks like if I take the knight, black takes the bishop and he's fine. But I actually have the in-between move, bishop to c5, tickling the queen on e7. If you go queen c7 to keep pressure on the bishop, I have bishop b6, hitting the queen and the rook, and now white wins the game. And if you move the queen anywhere else, I simply take the horse, and I have an extra bishop on the board. But as I realized to my horror while I was calculating this, after I take the bishop on c4, black has this very nice move, knight to a3, hitting the rook on b1. Everything's under attack. The bishop and knight are under attack, potentially. The bishop on a7 is a little bit loose. The rook's under attack. And white no longer even has an advantage. So once I realized, I was like, okay, then if I'm not happy with ed5 or bishop takes a7, I have to go for the third option, which is to play e5 here, attacking the knight on f6. And now Pranav plays knight to e8, and I go bishop to c1 here. And the reason I'm able to play this move, as opposed to, say, rook a6, if I were to take, by the way, black gets his fork of the queen and the knight, and black is fine. And when I go bishop c1 with the queen on f2, I have ideas to take the knight on c2, as well as spying on the pawn on a7. And again, we have a classic right triangle. So here Pranav plays d4. Now, during the game, as soon as I played this move, bishop to c1, I realized to my horror that after bishop takes c4, bishop c4, for example, black does have this move queen c5 to try and trade off the queens and win back either the bishop on c4 or the knight on c3. However, computer says that after takes, rook b2 and knight d4, bishop to e3, white is still winning because when black takes with the pawn, if black were to take with the rook, by the way, you just take the knight, and bishop guards the knight, rook guards the bishop, and white is up a piece. And after d takes c4, you trade off the bishop for the knight, you go rook b8, and then rook a7, and the idea of double stacking the rooks on the back rank is simply overwhelming. So it still would have been winning, but I did get scared for a second. Now, probably I would not have had these thoughts if I hadn't spent 20 minutes and miscalculated several tactical ideas during the game. So here we got the move d4 being played by Pranav instead, and now I go knight to e4. And now because I've kicked this knight back to e8, I've created a lot of space for the knight, and I have ideas like bishop g5 or to put pressure on the bishop on a6. So we get rook c6. And now I play this move bishop g5, which is still good, but obviously at this point the time advantage has ebbed away to some degree, and now I have to move quicker. If I had 30 minutes on the clock, probably I would have played this move bishop d3, knight to e3, and now this very nice move queen to a2, guarding the pawn on c4, all the while putting pressure on the bishop on a6 and the pawn on a7. And after bishop c8, bishop to a3, and a move like queen d7, white can simply go bishop b4, and after a6, I think white is bishop a5 to win some material, and if black stops it, you get knight d6 with a classic bastion, and white is doing very, very well. So probably if I have 30 minutes, I can come up with this, but instead, with only 15 minutes, I play the logical attacking move with bishop g5, we get f6, and now I go bishop h4, which is a blunder. Now, the reason I played bishop h4 is I figured with the queen, the rook, and the pawn here, the bishop and the knight, everything is aiming at these pieces on this diagonal, and the bishop looks very, very menacing. Computer says after takes bishop h6, white is actually close to winning here, simply because you don't need to go after this weak pawn on f6. Instead, you can play for rook a1, queen g3, and the weak black king is a serious issue. But I go bishop h4, and again, I'm very happy with this move because I have straightforward ideas to target the pawn. We get knight to e3 from Pranav, trying to bring his knight back into the game. I go rook a1 here, stacking the rooks and pressuring the bishop and the pawn. We get bishop c4, I take on f6, takes, rook a7, and now he finds the only move with rook d7. If black were to play queen f8 here, trying to guard everything, I can go queen g3, king to h8, and now I have the beautiful sacrifice. Rook takes h7, sacking the rook. And after king h7, rook to a7 check. If black goes king h8, there's queen g6, and checkmate is looming. If black plays knight g7, I can take king h8, queen g6. And again, the mates are overwhelming here with the queen, the rook, and the knight. Last but not least, if black plays king h6, I can go bishop g5, checking the king, takes his mate. And if you go king h5, I have queen h4, king g6, and queen h7, which is GG on the spot. So I was really happy about this, but on the other hand, Pranav used his time and found the move rook d7 to keep the game going. Now, it's very difficult here because when you look at the position, black's king is open. I have the bishop and the knight targeting the pawn. I've got the rooks on the open lane. I've got queen g3 here. It looks like I should be winning on the spot. But it's not that easy. And if I play even one wrong move, say I go like rook a3, for example, after takes, and rook c1, suddenly black gets knight f1 and knight g3 with the fossil, and I lose the game. Even something like rook c2 is looming in the air here, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, black is doing very, very well. So I do have to be very careful. So instead, I play rook a8 here, which is apparently a mistake. Probably I should have traded the rooks and gone for this knight f6 line. Reason I didn't play this, by the way, was because of king f7, and I simply missed this queen h4 move to put pressure on the h file. But nonetheless, even here, after knight to f5, it doesn't look so obvious why white should be winning here. Apparently, g4 gives white a big advantage. But in this position, the pieces are coming off the board. It's simplifying. And we still have quite a few moves to go before we get to move 40. So I don't want to oversimplify if I can avoid it, or if I can help it. So I play rook a8 here, hoping to sacrifice the rook for the knight on e8 and win the game with some forks on f6. Pranav plays king f7, and now I go f4, which is the only move here to keep the advantage. I really wanted to play rook takes e8, sacking the rook, but after queen e8 and knight f6 and queen c8 here, knight takes d7 and queen d7, I'm not actually sure how much better I am, because black has this jumbo horse on e3. He wants to infiltrate and create the kebab on the 7th rank, and I'm not even sure that I would win this position. So luckily, I find this move f4 opening up a new diagonal for the light square bishop. Pranav trades the bishops, and now he plays rook d5, which loses on the spot. What he should have played was king g7 here. But again, king g7, a very tough move to play because there always are sacrifices with knight f6 creating forks here, and it just looks really, really scary. Additionally, Pranav has no time, so he plays rook d5 to stop the check on h5. And here I play this move bishop f2 after a 2-minute think. Now, the computer says that after bishop g5, white is simply winning because this threat of queen h5 is unstoppable. If black takes, you go check, king f8 here. And now after queen h6, king to f7. I believe you can take, and after knight g7, there's rook g8, which simply wins the knight here because black can't guard with the queen. And additionally, if black were to play, say, king g6 to stop the check on h5, now I can sack the rook, and after knight f6, queen c8, here I have the move queen to h5, which ends the game on the spot. So again, very difficult to see. The move that I had actually seen during the game was this move knight g5, but this sack doesn't work. So after takes, queen h5, and king f8, there simply is no more, there are no more pieces to sacrifice. I can play bishop g5, but after takes and rook c2, for example, queen guards the knight, the rook on c2 is very active, and I could maybe even end up in some trouble here. So I saw knight g5, but I did not see bishop g5, and as such, I play a very sensible move here, bishop to f2, targeting the knight on e3. And the main reason for playing this is I keep ideas like rook a7 alive, but mainly I might just want to trade the bishop for the knight. Say we get some position like, I don't know, let me just set up a position, something like this, for example. Even though with perfect play, black can probably save the game, white has easy moves, and black's king is very, very weak here, and with no time on the clock, it becomes much harder for the side that's defending than the side that is attacking. So I go bishop f2, and here Pranav plays knight c4 with 2 seconds on the clock. A mistake, but already very, very difficult to play. Computer wants rook c2, but again, after queen d3, I have threats like knight g5 or knight d6 here. The knight on e3 is loose, rook on c2 is loose, and it just, in my opinion, is too hard to defend. So Pranav goes knight c4, but now I can sack the bishop with bishop takes d4, and if black takes here, now I do get queen h5 check, and after king to f8, I can play queen h6, king f7, and we have the same thing here with queen h7, knight g7, and after rook to g8, I'm simply winning the knight on g7 and the game as well. So Pranav plays knight 4 to d6, trying to get to move 40. We're now on move number 36. He's very, very close. But unfortunately, he's not able to make it. Because after I go rook a7, threatening to win the queen, he blunders with this move, knight b7. Now, Pranav could have played rook c7 here, but after takes, rook to a7, knight to b7. In this position, I have queen b2 here, hitting the knight on b7, and after rook to d7 here, I can go queen b5, and there's a right triangle. The queen is swinging, the bishop and the knight are well placed. All of white's pieces are in perfect harmony, and black is simply losing. One sample line is queen c1 check, king h2, queen f4, hitting the king, but I have g3. The knight on e4 covers both the f2 and d2 squares, and after queen c7 back here, I can go queen h5, hitting the king and the knight. Let's say black was king f8 to guard the knight on e8. Now I have knight to c5 here, and the pressure on the 7th rank is overwhelming. I also am threatening knight e6 to fork the king and the queen. So Pranav plays knight b7 instead, but now I can sack the rook with rook takes knight, queen takes rook, rook to a7, and here Pranav resigns the game simply because he will not be able to save his queen. It's pinned here, and after queen a7, bishop a7, I have a queen, a knight, and a bishop for 2 rooks and a knight. If he was able to, say, win this bishop, for example, here, and have 2 rooks for a queen, that would be completely fine, but here, with a queen and a bishop for the 2 rooks combined with the weak king on f7, it's simply hopeless. And Pranav resigns the game here. I win this game, and I now move to 6 points out of 8. Now, what does that mean for their overall standings? Now, Arjun Erigaisi from India, he won a very nice game against David Paravian from Russia to move to 6.5 points out of 8. He is the sole leader at this juncture with 1 round to go. Now, I may or may not play him tomorrow. Regardless, I'm in the hunt. I'm a half point behind Arjun. So tomorrow I will give it my all, and we'll see where the chips land. On that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of round number 8 of the Qatar Masters Open here in Doha. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I'll be back tomorrow with a recap after the 9th and final round of this great open event here in Doha. See you guys. Bye.